Imagine this. An old woman sits on her porch in the misty mountains, her voice thin but clear. The tune she sings is simple, almost a lullaby. But the words tell of a jealous lover, a flash of steel, and a shallow grave by the river. This isn't just a song, it's a coroner's report. It's a witness statement from a ghost. Now imagine realizing that the hills around you are filled with these musical affidavits, detailing every kind of human tragedy imaginable. What if the darkest secrets of a region weren't written in dusty court records, but were hidden in plain sight, carried on a mournful melody? And who was the strange, suit-wearing lawyer who dared to venture into those isolated hollers to collect them? Today, we follow the man who became a detective of the past, using a banjo instead of a magnifying glass to uncover the bloody sagas the mountains tried to forget. Before we follow the man in the suit, we must first understand the world he was trying to save. In the early 1900s, the Appalachian Mountains were a nation unto themselves, a place where time flowed like creek water, slowly and in its own channel. The true victims of this story weren't just the people in the ballads, it was the memory of them, a living history held together by the frailest of threads, the human voice. This was a world built on self-reliance, where your closest neighbor might be a 2-hour walk over a ridge, and the law was often a distant, abstract idea. The keepers of these stories were not scholars or poets. They were farmers whose hands were stained with the same soil that would one day cover them. They were mothers who sang murder ballads to their children like lullabies, not to frighten them, but to teach them about the very real dangers of the world. Their lives were a cycle of hardship and small joys, marked by the seasons, the birth of a child, or the death of a neighbor. Their dreams were not of fame or fortune, but of a good harvest, healthy livestock, and a winter with enough firewood to keep the cold at bay. The mountains themselves were a living character in every story. They were a fortress that protected this unique culture, but also a prison that bred isolation and suspicion. A foggy hollow could hide a moonshine still, a family feud, or a fresh grave with equal ease. The deep woods and winding trails that were a source of life and sustenance could also swallow a person whole, leaving behind nothing but a whispered story. Justice here was often personal, and consequences were swift and final. These ballads, then, were more than just entertainment for long winter nights. They were the community's collective memory, its legal code, and its moral compass. A song about a betrayed lover was a stark warning. A ballad recounting a feud served as a map of bad blood, reminding each new generation who their friends were and who they could never trust. To lose these songs would be like a town losing its courthouse records, its newspaper archives, and its gravestones all at once. But even in this isolated world, shadows were beginning to gather. The first crackle of the radio was starting to echo through the hollers, bringing with it new songs from faraway cities. Young folks were hearing tales of a different life, a world of electricity and automobiles, and some were beginning to see the old ways as a burden. An entire library of ghosts, a complete history of human passion, violence, and sorrow, was at risk of fading into an unspoken silence, and only a very few seemed to notice. When Bascom Lamar Lunsford arrived in a remote holler, he was stepping into a unique kind of crime scene, one where the evidence was not bloodstains or broken furniture, but fading memories and fractured melodies. The first sign that something was wrong was often the silence. He would visit a family known for its music, only to find the younger generation knew the latest radio hit, but not the half-forgotten ballad their own grandfather used to sing about a local tragedy. The air was thick with an unnatural quiet, the sound of a culture slowly losing its voice. The clues he found were scattered and cryptic. In one cabin, he might collect a single haunting verse of the Omi Wise saga, a piece of the story preserved like a shard of bone. Miles away, over another ridge, he might hear the same melody, but attached to a different set of words, the names changed to protect a long-dead ancestor. He would find specific, tangible details embedded in the lyrics, the mention of the Yadkin River, or a landmark like Adam's Falls, clues that felt as real and specific as a footprint left at the scene of a crime. These weren't just random stories, they were anchored to the very soil beneath his feet. Yet this evidence only deepened the mystery. The scene spoke of chaos and the ravages of time. For every fact a song seemed to preserve, it offered 10 contradictions. Was Tom Dula a heartless killer, or a handsome fool manipulated by a jealous woman? The ballads Lunsford collected painted him as both, sometimes in the very same version. The trail of truth was overgrown with decades of gossip, family pride, and the simple, inevitable erosion of memory. The mountains held the secrets, but they offered no easy answers. Lunsford quickly realized his task was far more complex than simple recording. He was an archaeologist of sorrow, trying to reconstruct a complete skeleton from a handful of scattered, mismatched bones. Every person he spoke to was a witness, but their testimony was shaped by who told them the story and why. The wilderness he was navigating wasn't just the dense laurel thickets and steep ravines of the Blue Ridge, but the tangled, treacherous landscape of human memory itself, and it was filled with a multitude of unsettling questions. The first and most powerful suspect in the slow murder of these mountain sagas was the community itself. Lunsford quickly discovered that the greatest threat to a story was often the pain it carried. These weren't tales of distant kings and queens, they were raw, open wounds in the local memory. To sing about a young woman drowned in a river was to remember the real girl whose family still lived just down the creek. The songs were a constant reminder of a neighbor's betrayal, an ancestor's shame, or a violence that had torn families apart. Forgetting was not an accident. It was a choice, a form of self-preservation. The motive was a deep and understandable desire to bury the past. Many families felt a personal vendetta against the very history that defined them. As the 20th century progressed, the outside world began to cast a long shadow, bringing with it a condescending judgment of Appalachian life. The stereotype of the violent, feuding hillbilly was taking root, and these murder ballads felt like Exhibit A. To the younger generation especially, these songs were not a proud heritage, but a source of shame, a link to a brutal past they were desperate to escape. They wanted radios and cars, not grim reminders of the bad old days. The evidence of this quiet conspiracy was everywhere Lunsford looked. He'd approach an old man known to be a master fiddler and ask about a specific feud ballad, only to be met with a stony silence and the curt reply, "We don't trouble with that one no more." Parents actively stopped teaching the darkest songs to their children, preferring to pass on church hymns or the cheerful, impersonal tunes coming over the airwaves. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a deliberate act of cultural pruning, cutting away the painful branches of their own family trees. The community was turning on its own memories, hoping that silence would finally bring peace to the ghosts that haunted their hollows. If shame was driving the old songs into the shadows, a more seductive threat was beginning to change them in the open. The second suspect was someone no one wanted to point a finger at, the most gifted and ambitious musicians themselves. These were the keepers of the flame, the high priests of the tradition, the very people Lunsford sought out as his most valuable sources. Their betrayal wasn't one of malice, but of temptation, a quiet corruption that came from within the circle of trust. The secret motive was the dazzling promise of the modern world, delivered on a spinning shellac disc. In the 1920s, talent scouts from record labels like Victor and OK began venturing into the mountains. They weren't looking for historical documents, they were hunting for hits. They offered cash money, a life-changing sum for a family living on the edge of poverty, for a 3-minute recording. Suddenly, a song wasn't just a piece of heritage. It was a potential ticket to a life beyond the cornfield and the coal mine. A musician who had only ever played for neighbors at a barn dance was now being offered a small taste of immortality. Lunsford began to see the evidence of this pact everywhere. A long, grim ballad he had collected in its pure form from an elderly woman would reappear on a commercial record, but it would be different. The 15-verse saga of a bloody feud, with all its specific names and local details, was trimmed to a tidy 3 minutes. The killer's chilling, remorseless confession was replaced with a more palatable, moralizing chorus. The very soul of the story, its raw, uncomfortable truth, was being sanitized for sale. The custodians of the culture, in their understandable desire for a better life, were becoming agents of its alteration, polishing the jagged edges off the evidence until it no longer told the whole story. But the most dangerous intruder didn't carry a gun or a land deed. It arrived in a polished wooden box and spoke with 1,000 voices from a world away. The third suspect was a vast, impersonal, and relentless force, the rise of national mass media spearheaded by the radio. This was an entity with no face and no name, an invisible invader that could slip through the cracks of the tightest-knit community and whisper its promises directly into the heart of the home. Its motive was not malicious. It was something far more powerful: commerce. The radio wasn't interested in preserving the grim history of a specific mountain county. Its purpose was to create a single, unified American culture, one that bought the same soap, drove the same cars, and listened to the same songs. The old ballads, with their dark themes, rough edges, and hyper-local references, were an obstacle to this new, streamlined world. They were static in the signal of progress, a relic that didn't fit into a tidy, half-hour sponsored program. The presence of this threat created a quiet, creeping sense of cultural anxiety. The ancient art of storytelling, of passing a song from one generation to the next on a cold winter's night, was suddenly in competition with professional comedians and crooners from Nashville and New York. The local fiddler, a hero in his community for decades, now sounded amateurish compared to the polished bands broadcasting from the Grand Ole Opry. This external force didn't need to threaten or intimidate. Its very existence was a judgment. It carried an air of quiet menace, not with violence, but with the subtle, corrosive suggestion that the old ways were no longer good enough. In the beginning, Bascom Lamar Lunsford approached his collection like the lawyer he was, with a methodical belief that for every crime there was a single, definitive truth. He ventured into the mountains not just as a collector, but as an investigator, certain that he could track down the one pure version of each ballad, the original testimony that had been passed down unaltered through the generations. He believed that somewhere, in the most remote cabin, held in the memory of the oldest living soul, was the definitive, uncorrupted story of what truly happened to Laura Foster. He pursued this phantom through the rugged wilderness of human memory. He would meticulously record what he believed was the final word on the Tom Dula saga from a farmer in Wilkes County, only to travel 20 miles over the next ridge and hear a contradictory version from the man's own cousin. One song painted Tom as a romantic fool, another as a heartless killer. Ann Melton was a jealous accomplice in one holler and an innocent victim of rumor in the next. Every promising lead, every witness who claimed to have the real story from their great-grandmother, only led to another dead end, another fork in the trail. The single solid truth he sought was a red herring. He also assumed that the most celebrated local musicians, the prize-winning fiddlers and banjo pickers, would be the most reliable keepers of the ancient songs. He followed the sound of their music to barn dances and town squares, hoping to find the mother lode. But this trail, too, quickly went cold. He discovered that these were often the very people who had already been compromised. They were the first to be tempted by the record companies, the quickest to alter a 15-verse ballad into a catchy 3-minute tune. Their brilliant playing was often a cover for a story that had been stripped of its soul. The frustration for Lunsford must have been immense. The logical, orderly processes that worked in a courtroom were useless here. The evidence was alive, constantly changing with every telling. His investigation was yielding not clarity, but a growing, maddening fog. In the communities, his relentless probing questions began to stir a quiet unease. The fear was growing that perhaps these stories were not meant to be solved. Perhaps in trying to untangle the truth, This man from the outside world was simply pulling apart the last fragile threads holding their entire history together. As Bascom Lamar Lunsford pushed deeper into the mountains, the friendly smiles and offered dippers of water remained, but a new barrier rose to meet him, one as real as a stone wall, yet completely invisible. He was running into the unspoken law of the hills, a code of silence as old as the feuds themselves. The moment he moved beyond pleasantries and asked for a specific bloody ballad by name, the air on the porch would grow still. Eyes would drop. The answer was almost always the same: a slow shake of the head and a quiet mumble of "don't rightly recall that one," or the even more final, "we let that story die with the old folks." The reasons for this omerta were buried deep in the soil of the community. These songs were not abstract folklore, they were active social documents. To sing the ballad of the Allen Griffin feud in front of an Allen was more than rude. It was a hostile act, a dredging up of bad blood that generations had worked to bury. The names in the verses were not characters in a fable, they were the names on the weathered tombstones in the churchyard just up the hill. Lunsford quickly learned he wasn't just asking for a song. He was asking a man to testify against his neighbor's great-grandfather, and that was a line no one was willing to cross for a stranger. There was also a deep and abiding suspicion of any outsider asking too many questions. Who was this man in a starched collar, writing down their tragedies in his little notebook? The mountains had a long memory of being exploited by timber companies, by coal barons, and by condescending writers who came to caricature their way of life. Was Lunsford any different? Was he a cultural undertaker, come to put their most painful memories on display for a gawking world that already saw them as little more than violent savages? The silence was a shield, a way of protecting what little they had left that was truly their own. The psychological toll on the few who considered breaking this code was immense. One old woman, who knew a version of a local murder ballad that Lunsford had been searching for years, would only agree to sing it for him in her spring house, with the door bolted and the sound of the running water masking her voice. She was terrified, not of physical harm, but of something worse: the judgment of her neighbors, the quiet shunning that would follow if they knew she had given away their ghosts. In these hills, a reputation was all a person had, and the price for breaking the wall of silence was to lose it forever. For months, perhaps years, Bascom Lamar Lunsford operated as a detective chasing a ghost. He was searching for a single, verifiable truth, a definitive version of each ballad that could be entered into the record as historical fact. But the mountains resisted. The contradictions piled up. The silence grew deeper, and the logical mind of the lawyer was nearing a point of despair. He had a collection of beautiful broken fragments, but the complete, unassailable story he sought remained as elusive as smoke. The trail, it seemed, had finally gone cold. The turning point came not with a dramatic deathbed confession, but in a moment of quiet frustration. He was sitting on a porch with an elderly woman, trying once again to coax from her the full version of a local feud ballad. She would sing the beginning, her voice strong and sure, but when it came to the verses describing the killing, she would stop, shake her head, and hum a different tune, a simple, mournful church hymn. Lunsford, seeing another day's work dissolving into another dead end, was about to pack his things. But then he stopped, and he listened. He truly listened, not to the words, but to the feeling behind them. In the sorrowful cadence of that hymn, he suddenly heard the echo of the murder ballad. The forgotten clue wasn't a hidden lyric or a secret name. It was the realization that the emotion was the one thing that had survived intact. The community might change the names, forget the details, or refuse to speak the violence, but they never forgot the grief. The hymn was their way of telling the story when the story itself became too terrible to tell. It was the emotional core, the untainted piece of evidence he had been overlooking this whole time. This moment changed everything. It was as if a key had turned in a lock he didn't even know was there. He realized his entire approach had been wrong. He was not a detective hunting for a single culprit or a single truth. He was an archivist of human heartbreak. The contradictions and variations weren't flaws in the evidence. They were the evidence. They showed how a community grappled with, processed, and tried to heal from a trauma over generations. A renewed urgency surged through him. He had to collect it all, every fractured verse, every sanitized radio version, every mournful hymn that carried the ghost of the original tragedy. The real story wasn't in any single song, it was in the sum of all of them. With this new understanding, Bascom Lamar Lunsford stood like a prosecutor ready to deliver his closing argument. But in the spectral courtroom of his mind, the witness stand was empty, and the jury box was filled with ghosts. He had spent years searching for a single villain responsible for the slow death of the mountain sagas. He had cross-examined shame, ambition, and the relentless march of progress. And now, as he pieced together the fragments of evidence, the half-remembered verses, the sanitized records, the telling silences, the horrifying truth finally took shape. There was no single culprit. It was a conspiracy. He finally saw the first conspirator for what it was, the community's own shame. This was the inside man, the accomplice who unlocked the door and let the other forces in. The raw, bloody memories of the ballads had become a burden, a mark of otherness in a world that was rapidly modernizing. By choosing to bury their most painful stories, by refusing to teach their children the songs of feud and betrayal, the mountain folk had, with the best intentions, created a vacuum. They had disarmed their own culture, leaving it vulnerable and defenseless against the coming storm. Into this vacuum stepped the second conspirator, the gifted local musician, tempted by the promise of a world beyond the mountains. These were not villains, but tragic figures caught between two worlds. Driven by the understandable human desire for a few dollars and a little recognition, they became the unwitting agents of the crime. They took the raw, unvarnished testimony of the old songs and polished it for public consumption. They cut out the darkest verses, smoothed over the rough language, and sold a palatable, commercialized ghost of the real thing. They were the ones who put the forged signature on a false confession. And finally, Lunsford saw the mastermind, the cold, impersonal force that had orchestrated the entire affair, the radio and the rise of a national commercial culture. This was the entity that provided the motive, the means, and the opportunity. It offered a shiny, new, and effortless form of entertainment that made the old ways seem obsolete. It whispered the promise of a unified America where everyone listened to the same songs and shared the same simple stories. It created the very shame that had weakened the community's resolve and offered the very temptation that had turned its own guardians against it. In the end, Lunsford's discovery was far more chilling than a single, identifiable villain. The true culprit was an unholy trinity, a perfect and terrible collaboration between the past, the present, and the future. The motive wasn't malice, but something far more powerful, the inevitable crushing weight of change. The ancient, isolated world of the mountains, with its dark memories and bloody sagas, had been put on trial by the 20th century. And in this trial, there could only be one verdict. The old world was found guilty of being old, and the sentence was death by forgetting. Now that we have identified the culprits, we can finally reconstruct the crime. This was not a murder committed in a dark alley with a single sudden blow. It was a slow poisoning carried out in the warm, fire-lit cabins of the mountains themselves, with the victims' own families as unknowing accomplices. The truth, my friends, is that the ballads were not killed. They were allowed to die. Imagine an old man, a patriarch, sitting on his porch with his grandson as the evening shadows stretch across the holler. He clears his throat to sing the old ballad, the one about the land dispute that cost his own great-uncle his life. He begins the first verse, his voice a familiar, comforting rasp. But then he looks at the boy, who is wearing a store-bought shirt and whose mind is full of things like automobiles and the world beyond the ridge. and the old man's voice falters. The next words, the ones about the gunshot and the bitter feud, freeze in his throat. In that moment of silence, a story that had survived for a century suffers a mortal wound. It doesn't end with a scream, but with a quiet, heartbreaking stillness. Now picture a different scene, a few years later. A talented young fiddler, the pride of his county, sits stiffly in front of a strange, cone-shaped microphone in a makeshift studio in a Bristol hotel room. A man in a suit tells him he has 3 minutes. He begins to sing the saga of Omi Wise, but when he gets to the part where the villain pleads with her, he softens the words. He changes a raw, brutal line into a more poetic, romantic one. The man in the suit nods in approval, and with that single, simple change, the soul of the song begins to bleed out, replaced by something cleaner, safer, and no longer entirely true. The final blow came not from a person, but from a piece of furniture. See it in your mind's eye, a family gathered in their cabin after supper. For generations, this was the time for stories, for the banjo to be taken down from its peg. But now, in the corner, sits a handsome wooden box with a glowing dial, a single cyclops eye staring into the room. They turn a knob, and a clear voice from Nashville fills the cabin with a song about a love they've never known and a city they've never seen. They are captivated. And over in the shadows, the banjo hangs on the wall, untouched. Its strings are not broken, they are simply silent. This is how the great bloody sagas of the mountains met their end. There was no single gunshot, no grand battle. It was 1,000 tiny, quiet surrenders. A forgotten verse here, a changed lyric there, an evening spent listening to the radio instead of a grandfather's voice. The stories became ghosts in their own homes, fading slowly until only a faint, melodic echo remained. They weren't murdered in a fit of passion. They were simply starved, one by one, in the quiet, comfortable darkness of a new and brighter world. There was no grand courtroom for this crime, no judge in black robes. The trial of the mountain ballads was held in the Court of Progress, and the jury was the American people, whose ears were already filled with the siren song of a new century. The prosecution, a slick and powerful attorney called the Future, presented its case with devastating force. It showed evidence of a faster, brighter, more connected world, a world of convenience and prosperity that made the old ways seem slow, dark, and obsolete. The defense was barely heard, a few faint, mournful notes from an old fiddle, drowned out by the confident roar of the radio. The accused parties reacted to the proceedings in their own ways. The commercial media, the mastermind, showed no remorse. A force of nature doesn't apologize for the storm. The ambitious musicians who had altered the songs for profit took the stand with a mix of defiance and quiet regret, arguing they had simply made a deal to survive in a world that was leaving them behind. And the community itself, the accomplice, sat in silent acceptance of its fate. They had already bought the radios and listened to the new songs. They had, in effect, already pled guilty. The verdict was swift and nearly unanimous. The ancient, bloody sagas of the mountains were found guilty on all counts, guilty of being too complex, too sorrowful, and too stubbornly local for a modern, optimistic nation. The sentence was not execution, but something far more final: obsolescence. They were to be banished from the front porch and the public square, remanded to the custody of a few dusty archives and forgotten collections, their stories replaced by a simpler, more cheerful narrative that sold more records. This verdict was, at the time, overwhelmingly popular. It was called Progress, Enlightenment, the inevitable march of history. But in this vast, impersonal courtroom, there was one man who refused to accept the judgment. Bascom Lamar Lunsford did not act as a lawyer for the defense. It was far too late for that. Instead, he appointed himself the court clerk for the condemned. He worked tirelessly, not to overturn the verdict, but to create a perfect, unassailable transcript of the proceedings. He recorded every last piece of evidence, every haunting testimony, not for this trial, but for an appeal to a higher court, the court of history. And so, while the world celebrated a victory, Lunsford preserved the memory of what was lost. He ensured that the case of the mountain ballads would never truly be closed. He created a file so thick with sorrow and beauty that future generations would be forced to reopen it, to re-examine the evidence and ask themselves a chilling question. Was this justice, or was it a crime? It's a verdict that, thanks to him, still sparks arguments in these hills to this day. The verdict had been handed down, and the consequences rippled through the mountains for generations, changing the fate of everyone involved. The survivors of this cultural crime, the ballads themselves, were now safe, but forever altered. Rescued by Lunsford, they were no longer living, breathing stories shared on a porch. They became ghosts in a filing cabinet, their voices captured on wax cylinders and stored in the climate-controlled vaults of the Library of Congress. They were saved from extinction, but at the cost of their freedom. They had become specimens, butterflies pinned under glass, their beautiful, tragic patterns preserved, but their flight forever ended. For the community, the people of the mountains, the verdict of obsolete had a devastating, long-term effect. The silence that Lunsford had encountered became the new normal. A generation grew up disconnected from the bloody sagas that had once defined their ancestors' world. The caricature of the simple, banjo-strumming hillbilly, once a condescending fiction, began to feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many of the brightest young people, convinced that their heritage was a source of shame, left the mountains for the cities, leaving behind an aging population and a profound sense of cultural amnesia. They had been judged by the outside world, and in their hearts, many felt their own culture had been found wanting. The descendants of the guilty parties, meanwhile, thrived in ways no one could have predicted. The ambitious musicians who had sanitized the old songs for commercial appeal became the founding fathers of a global phenomenon. The DNA of their altered ballads, the simple chords, the narrative style, the themes of love and loss, mutated and evolved, becoming the bedrock of what the world would come to know as country music. In a bitter twist of fate, the very act of betrayal ensured a kind of immortality. The raw, uncomfortable truth of the mountains was gone, but its polished, commercially viable ghost now echoed from every radio in the nation. And so, the lives of everyone in those mountains were forever changed. A people who had once known exactly who they were, their identity rooted in a deep and often dark well of shared stories, were now set adrift. They inherited the accent, the family names, and the stunning, unforgiving landscape, but they had lost the lyrical map that explained what it all meant. They became haunted not by the ghosts of the old stories, but by the far more unsettling ghost of their absence. You might think the story ends there, in a dusty archive, with the final verdict rendered by a changing world. But if you know where to look, you can still find the evidence of Bascom Lamar Lunsford's investigation scattered all across these hills. The traces of his work have not vanished. They have simply sunk into the soil, becoming part of the landscape itself. The most tangible remnant of his crusade is the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival, which he founded in Asheville in 1928. It still happens every year. On a warm summer night, you can go there and see the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the very people he interviewed. You can see them playing the same banjos, dancing the same steps, and most importantly, singing the same songs. It is a living, breathing wake, a place where the ghosts Lunsford collected are brought out into the light, not to be mourned, but to be celebrated. It is his final, defiant piece of evidence, presented to a new jury year after year. The songs themselves are another echo. Thanks to the collection he so painstakingly assembled, the ballads did not die. They were rediscovered. The raw, haunting melodies he saved from oblivion became a wellspring for the American folk revival of the 1950s and 60s. When a modern artist stands on a stage in New York or London and sings the chilling tale of Tom Doola, they are, whether they know it or not, calling on one of Lunsford's ghosts. His work ensured that these hyper-local tragedies became part of a universal human story. And the story of Lunsford himself has become a piece of Appalachian folklore. The whispers about the minstrel lawyer still linger. He is remembered not just as a collector, but as a mythical figure, a man who walked between worlds and knew the mountain's darkest secrets. The legend of the man who knew where the bodies were buried has outlived almost everyone who told it, a testament to the power of a man who listened so intently that he became part of the story he was trying to save. But the most powerful echo is in the land itself. The rivers where lovers were betrayed still flow. The sharp ridges that once divided warring families still cut across the sky. These places hold the memory of what happened there, etched into the very rock and soil. Bascom Lamar Lunsford's greatest achievement was not that he saved the songs, but that he saved the connection between the songs and the land. And now, when you hear one of those old ballads, it feels as if the mountain itself is singing, telling you its own dark and beautiful secrets. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning, around our digital campfire. What if a region's darkest secrets were carried not in books, but on a melody? We now have our answer. The secrets were a community's soul, its open wounds, its moral code, and its cautionary tales. And the strange man in the suit who collected them was more than a folklorist. He was a custodian of ghosts. Bascom Lamar Lunsford understood that these weren't just songs. They were the last, fading testimony of a world on trial, and he was the only lawyer willing to take the case. This is a story, then, not just of a man saving songs, but of the immense, often brutal price of progress. It is a timeless lesson on the seduction of forgetting. It teaches us that the most dangerous threat to a culture is rarely an invading army, but more often a quiet, internal whisper that tells us our own complicated, painful history is a burden we should lay down in favor of a simpler, brighter future. Lunsford's great crusade was a fight against this seductive silence, an argument that our scars are not meant to be hidden. They are proof that we have lived, and they are warnings that must never, ever be forgotten. Bascom Lamar Lunsford fought a war against the quiet death of memory, and in the end, he did not win. No one could. But he achieved something far more important. He ensured that the ghosts of Appalachia would never be homeless. He gave them a permanent refuge in the archives of a nation, and a voice that could still be heard by anyone willing to listen. And now, my friends, the story is yours to keep. The next time you hear an old, mournful tune carried on the wind, listen closely. It might not be the wind at all, but a story that, thanks to one stubborn man, refused to stay silent.